Thank you very much to CIHRRC for inviting me here, and congratulations to Kelly and her group for this amazing two-day forum. It's been quite a whirlwind tour, and it's been an amazing opportunity to share stories and expertise. So I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be here today. The presentation that I'm going to give you a very brief overview on is available online. So the full document can be accessed online, which in fact I'm sure many of you in this room at this point in the day would prefer to kind of flip through it at your leisure than have me walk you through it extensively. So what I'd like to do then is just talk to you a little bit about where this came from. And in fact, most of you have seen this beautiful document. And if you notice, and I'm sorry I don't have it up on there, and NCAM was very gracious in letting me rearrange my slides early in the morning, so thank you for that. But this slide didn't make it into my deck. But just if you notice, on this side, there is this access to rehabilitation question that came up in our conversations. And what I was really interested in knowing is the people, and this is partly Will's fault too, so pay attention to this, Will, because there might be a question coming your way in a moment, Tito. The issue really was, for people who end up in rehab services, are they there because they are the worst of the worst, and I mean that in a nice way, and for people who actually need rehab services as a health promotion or prevention issue, if they're not making it in there because there is this access to that's being filtered by policy requirements around eligibility, that sort of sparked my interest about this question. So again, thank you to Kelly, and thank you to the others in this room who are willing to take this journey with me. And again, it's going to be short and sweet, unlike myself. So this was funded through the CIHRRC Center for REACH. So that is the Research Evidence into Action in Community Health and HIV. And what I just wanted to do, and I know all of you in this room know this, and if I had known what you were all going to say before I put my slides together, you wouldn't see a lot of this content, just so you know. So we as a group and people beyond rehab, because I'm actually a medical sociologist by training, but we do know that life expectancy of those affected by HIV has really changed since the advent of antiretroviral therapy. So that's sort of a given. However, there was a sort of contested point in time where HIV was shifting from this death sentence discourse to that of a chronic episodic illness. But what was really interesting is that although we're having those conversations in this room and beyond, the policies that are out there, the policy approaches to dealing with this sort of, okay, if this has changed, then how should our policies mirror those changes and how we're conceptualizing this particular condition? So we recognize that the needs of this population go beyond what our policies are currently at. So as a professor of health promotion, I just need to put this little plug in. We know that health promotion aims to address the underlying determinants of population risk through this multi-sectoral approach, which includes policy approaches. And this is a really important tool in health promotion in terms of changing or shifting the aggregate of a population health. So we know that policy can achieve several things. It can in fact be a driver, I would argue, for health across the lifespan, and it can actually help us determine priorities and what those priorities ought to look like. So we can actually frame it in a policy direction, and we can use that to inform our responses. So this can include obviously things such as healthcare policy, public health policies, et cetera. And these influence the way we deliver and offer healthcare. And this is why I was really sort of questioning Will's supposition that some of the people that he sees are actually, doing fairly well. Other people would say, no, these are people who came in having had a heart attack or a stroke, and they are then sent to rehab. So my question is, how do those people get there, and who are you seeing, and is that a byproduct of some other artifacts, such as the distribution of healthcare resources and this issue of access? Now, where I'm going with this is the notion of healthy aging. So this is a really important conceptual framework, I think, to bring into this conversation around living longer and living well with HIV. So we have medications that are advancing life. We have policies that are, I would argue, not really currently up to the task of dealing with this issue of healthy aging. So we know that healthy aging is a really important process in terms of slowing down physically, cognitively, and that can be sort of a normal process, inverted commas, normal process. So what's the difference then in terms of how healthy aging conceptually is understood in the articulation of healthy public policies, for example. So healthy aging and HIV, we know there's all kinds of physiological effects associated with antiretroviral therapy. Not all of those, I would argue, are fully understood or fully appreciated, because the sort of disentangling from this is normal, quote unquote, aging versus this is related to HIV. So I would suggest that few policy frameworks are actually allowing for this space around healthy aging for people with HIV, and that there's actually limited visibility of people with HIV as a population within this public health discourse. So back in time to 2008, where some of this stuff that informs this stuff came about from Kelly's brain, and the people that Kelly works with. And this was actually really fascinating, because I can remember the first time I saw this and I was like, what is going on there? And yes, I'm not a rehab specialist, but I was like, I don't get it. What's going on? Because what you would normally see, here's a little demonstration, is you're diagnosed with something and you just continue circling down the girdle until you end up dead. And so there was this kind of interesting notion of the inability of policies to be nimble enough to actually look at how these episodic disabilities occur over time. Everybody with me? Hooray. Okay, so I have taken the liberty of slightly adjusting this schematic, and what was referred to as lifestyle factors, I actually call modifiable risk factors, because lifestyle implies it's just an individual choice, and that sort of removes the structural characteristics within which a person lives and operates, etc. And I also put the little inverted commas over normal aging, because that's highly, I would guess, contested. So we know that all of these factors collectively constitute premature aging for those living with HIV, and yet we don't necessarily see this reflected in policies that are out there, and I'll give you some examples. So the two examples, well, I'm going to skip over some of this because I think we're probably all at the end of our tethers, but so essentially this notion of healthy aging policy, specifically in relation to HIV, was the impetus for this very small study with a very small amount of money and a whole pile of people trying to chime in and make this happen. So to all of you in the room, I appreciate your help with this. So what we wanted to do was look at a review of policies related to HIV with specific reference where we could find it in access to rehabilitation, to provide us with some insights into healthy aging across the lifespan for populations living with HIV. So this is my take on what my brain thinks it should look like, something like this. So we've got this sort of notion of healthy aging policy, and within that, we've got chronic illnesses, we've got people living with HIV, and we've got older people as an aggregate. And there's obviously an overlap conceptually and in fact. But what I'm really struggling with is this notion of sort of political and ideological forces that shape the direction that health policies take. So we know that in Canada, for example, with respect to harm reduction policies, the drug policy that actually spoke about the importance of things like safe injection facilities, those kinds of things were highly contested. So what I'm suggesting is when we're sort of framing this discussion about how we understand healthy aging policy for people living with HIV, we need to look at those broader social determinants of health, which I think we're all very well aware of, as well as political and ideological factors, and then the sort of healthcare expenditure. And for those of you who want a really easy late night read, Jeffrey Simpson's book called Chronic Condition, if you haven't read it, it's worth flipping through, and basically he's suggesting that if we spend something in the order of $200 billion in formal healthcare systems, do we need to hearken back to the 1974 Lalonde report or that 86 Ottawa Charter, and sort of refresh our memory about the fact that we can't afford to keep doing what we're doing and piling money into formal healthcare systems. We need to look at how we can use a more upstream approach in dealing with some of these issues. So the methodology we used in this case, it was a scoping review that used the sort of modeled itself after the David Dre and Gould 2009 paper, which is actually a really good paper. So is Kelly O'Brien's paper, which was really helpful. We conducted a scoping review of policies related to access to rehabilitation in Canada and the UK, and we drew from both Canadian and UK sources in relation to the intersections of HIV as a manageable chronic illness, because that was kind of the buzz at the time, and then health policy and access to rehabilitation more sort of straightforwardly. Are there eligibility criteria? You must be this tall to ride this whatever, and how does that weed people out from accessing certain services, and then as well a variety of key determinants of health such as gender, social inclusion, and age. So we had 730 documents from Canada, and I think way less from the UK, and part of that is an artifact of I was located in Canada, and I had a reference librarian across the street from me at Dal who was very helpful in weeding through the Canadian stuff, and we had a bit of a challenge with the UK literature, so that is clearly a limitation. So documents were then added into a spreadsheet, and they were initially categorized about whether they were HIV specific or whether they pertain to other issues. And what was fascinating is there are loads of policy directives and loads of organizations that deal with chronic diseases. Oh, 1 minute, holy smokes. And we had to do kind of a, does this resonate? And part of the reason why we read a whole pile more than what was just HIV specific is what we were trying to challenge ourselves with is look for those novel policies or discussions around the synergy between chronic episodic and moving some of the conversation further upstream, i.e. get people into services before they have a major episode of whatever it is. And so we did this ranking process, which was super fun because I had 2 great policy trainees who were like, what do we do? There's piles of paper everywhere. And so what we did to simplify things is we used sort of highly, peripherally, or not at all mentioned in our ranking scheme. And what these are the things that we're actually looking for. So age as a sort of access entry point. So again, do you have to be this old to access, fill in the blank, time since diagnosis, and we looked for novel ideas under each of these. So these were the kind of the key things that we were searching through the documents trying to find. This gives you a sense of how we organize things thematically. Yes, you have to do a bit of that. And so we looked at age and access, SES and access, so socioeconomic status and access, gender and access. Gender, just to be clear, gender as a social construct as opposed to just sex as a biological artifact. And I just want to clarify that when I talk about gender, I'm talking about that socially constructed inside-outside debate versus bits and bobs debate. And then provider as gatekeeper, and what was really interesting about provider as gatekeeper is we're sort of thinking about who refers, and this is, thanks again, Will, pay attention, here comes your question, does the provider determine who goes and when they go? And so then so Will is there like, come on, bring them in, let's have some more. And so what is that gatekeeping function doing in terms of keeping people well? So do you wait until somebody is hospitalized and then they go off to rehab as a condition of release back into the wild, or is there something else going on? Social inclusion was also a very interesting issue. So we're looking at other similar documents around, does the conversation around stigma or discrimination come up? Why is that important? Because we're arguing that within HIV, that's an ongoing artifact that makes HIV different than other chronic or episodic illnesses. Do you want me to just stop? Keep going? Okay. You can vote with your feet. Just get up and go for coffee. Just keep going, yeah? Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. Where's the big clock? Okay, great. And so what we did is we looked at where we could find specific things that resonated with us, and we kind of moved a little bit away from our categories, because what we found in terms of the provision of novel or wise practices required some of these things. So rehabilitation and care, and excellent example, thank you, about education to people who provide care. So that's super important, because if they don't know that individuals should perhaps be screened for certain things in advance, that has implications for long-term health outcomes. We know that. Building multidisciplinary teams. I feel like I'm just doing like a rapporteur from what you guys already talked about, because this sounds like you guys already know all this anyway. Addressing mental health needs, we've heard that. We heard that yesterday. We heard that again today. That's a super important issue. And again, it's a sort of which causes which. Does the HIV cause mental health issues, or these pre-existing conditions? And how do we find ways of screening for those early on? So again, the upstream approach to get people to the kinds of services that they need. Etc. So moving on to implications, our research suggests that HIV-specific considerations are required in health policy in order to ensure inclusive policy approaches appropriate for PHAs across the lifespan. So we're trying to be mindful of the fact that a 50-year-old PHA might present with something that is unusual within a given practice, and they might not be considered eligible for geriatric services, but in some instances, maybe that conversation needs to be had. So these considerations may also serve to reduce barriers in access to rehabilitation programs in terms of living healthy into older adulthood. Again, we know the sort of healthy aging frameworks fail to address the sort of non-linear, and back to Kelly's beautiful schematic, the sort of non-linear conceptualization of HIV-related periods of disability and wellness, super important in terms of the provision of care for people. And then determinants of health. This is like the 12-car pileup in the intersection. We can't determine that the bumper went through the windshield here. We actually need to sort of think about these holistically in order to develop appropriate healthy aging policies and programs. Some limitations. Again, Canada is, for all intents and purposes, purported to be a bilingual French-English country. However, we limited our document search to those that were English only. We had more access to Canadian policies and content than we did in the UK. We had some challenges in terms of definitional clarity between policy documents and context, and we had a fairly limited time frame to complete the review, and I had a good, clean amount of fun with the policy trainees, some of whom rotated out before this project finished, but super great group of people to work with. Oops. Hi, Ron. How's it going? Okay. So just a few key messages. We need to further address policy-related barriers to accessing health-promoting programs and services. That's my bias as somebody who's coming at this from health promotion. We need for more upstream, interdisciplinary, and structural responses to aging well in place with HIV and across the lifespan. We're kind of joking about the fact that I'm an aging queer person, and we have this conversation. One of the papers that I actually put in the pile for you guys to read is, as an aging queer person, I'm a bit worried about the kind of care I'm going to get when I can't get myself to the Gazunder. Yeah, I'll go live with you, Ron. And so those kinds of issues about living well in place are super important to people staying well. Enjoying their lives and living well in place is a really important issue. We need to improve measurement and evaluation techniques in determining the impact of policy approaches, because there's a whole pile of different approaches to how these policies are mounted and enacted and animated, but less so around how they're actually evaluated, and this need for multi-sectoral policy positions. So I'm just chucking it out there. Here's your question, Will. Do we need an action plan, some sort of a national policy action plan around healthy aging with HIV? You can send your answer later. I'd like to thank Alexandra Hillman, Eric Ross, Denver, and the other members of the Canadian-UK policy research team for their help along the way. And again, thank you to Kirk and Quigger for all of your amazing work, not just your input in this tiny little project, but for all the amazing stuff you do. Thank you.